Hello, folks. Welcome to the fifth and final installment of World War II. And here we see a very iconic image of the United States Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima and closing in the circle on Japan. And that's what we talk about here in the fifth and final installment of our World War II topic is the United States bringing it into the war in the Pacific and how it goes about doing that. Just give a little background. So the Japanese actually, I remember at Midway, way back in June of '42, lost all those aircraft carriers, which basically put them on the defensive for the remainder of the war. But the Japanese did manage actually to attack the U.S. mainland, not directly, but with these balloon bombs. This was one of the few attacks on America during this conflict, but by the Japanese. And basically, they Operation Fugo, they called it. They settled off these large balloons with incendiary bombs attached, and the idea was to get these things up in the jet stream, go across the Pacific Ocean, and land in the woods in the western United States and cause major forest fires and try to debilitate the U.S. economy somehow. When the government got wind of these balloons coming in, the government immediately sought to, first of all, shoot them down and get rid of them, but also to keep from the public the fact that these things were coming in. An African American regiment was actually sent out to the West Coast to watch for these things to come in and destroy them and shoot them down. And they asked for the press, to say nothing about it. But two, the only actual deaths caused by an enemy on American soil happened in Oregon. They killed a family of 6. They saw one of these that kind of crash landed in a wooded area, park area, and they went up to it and it exploded and killed them, sadly. But overall, those are the deaths on American soil during this conflict with these balloon bombs. But overall, the balloon bombs were not overly effective. Especially because the U.S. kept it covered up with the press. One actually landed as far as Michigan, though, so they did find their way, but the Japanese never really knew just how effective, if at all, these balloons were. Anyway, so basically what the United States is doing is by the time we get into 1944-45, it's closing the circle on Japan. And increasingly surrounding Japan by taking over major island bases. Saipan you see there in the Marianas Island chain in 1944, but by February 45, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, which is going to be some of the worst fighting of the war, by late spring, early summer of 45, as the United States is closing in the circle on Japan. And the idea at this point, of course, is to get air bases from where you can just launch from islands to attack Japan. And Okinawa, by the way, is where the Japanese committed most adamantly to kamikaze attacks on Okinawa. Thousands killed Americans and Japanese in that conflict. It's one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Pacific War. But to complicate matters more, in April of 45, FDR dies. It's actually about 2 weeks before Hitler kills himself in Nazi Germany. But when FDR dies, this guy, Harry S. Truman, the S standing for S, his parents just thought that it would add emphasis to his name. This guy, Harry S. Truman, becomes president, and the Americans, American public had no idea who this guy was. Back then, vice presidents didn't really play a big role in governing or any kind of strategy making. Truman had met FDR, maybe a couple of times in the midst of FDR's presidency, while Truman was the vice president for FDR's fourth term when he was elected. So Truman wouldn't have had really any major knowledge of the war other than what he read maybe in the New York Times or whatever. And Harry Truman was a failed haberdasher, sold men suits in Missouri, but was not so good at that. Got into politics, got into local politics, and made his way up to Congress and then the vice presidency. But all of a sudden, this ignoramus from Missouri, as they called him, is suddenly the president. But the thing about Harry Truman is Truman was definitely no ignoramus. Truman is our last president to have not had a college degree, but Truman was one of these guys who was very savvy, very commonsensical kind of guy who saw the world in this kind of black and white, and made very rational decisions based upon the facts before him. And he cussed like a sailor. But one of the things that Truman becomes aware of is something called the Manhattan Project. The United States under FDR had created a top secret program that was led by a guy named Leslie Groves. He was the general in charge, called the Manhattan Project, which was this top secret U.S. and really British as well mission operation to create the first atomic bomb. Well, Harry Truman, once he becomes president, he hears of this operation, and by July of 1945, he's going to get wind of the first successful test of this bomb. By July of 45, what has happened is Germany has been defeated. Remember, Germany fell and surrendered back in May. So by July, Harry Truman actually travels to a place called Potsdam, just outside of Berlin, which is in Germany. And in Potsdam, he meets with Joseph Stalin and Clement Attlee, who is now the new prime minister because Churchill actually loses his re-election bid, though Churchill is also at Potsdam. And while at Potsdam, Harry Truman gets news, it's whispered in his ear by one of his people, of the first ever successful test of an atomic bomb. And it took place out in New Mexico, out in the desert. And basically what these guys did, these scientists, is they erected a 100-foot tower made of metal, steel tower, and put the bomb up at the top of it and, set it to detonate and drove miles away. I don't know how many miles. Got into a bunker and, with their sunglasses on, basically looked out of the bunker and waited for the countdown and for the bomb to drop. And indeed it did, and it exploded. And the thing is that, shortly thereafter they went back to the scene, and what they found is pretty remarkable. That 100-foot steel tower was not blown into pieces. It wasn't, melted on the ground. It was just gone. It was completely dissolved. It evaporated. That's how powerful this bomb is. And now Truman knows that he has it. And when Truman hears of this while he's in Potsdam, he's going to initiate what is called the Potsdam Declaration, where essentially he says that the United States will accept nothing less than the complete unconditional surrender of Japan. Interestingly, too, somebody else who already knew what was being whispered in Truman's ear was Joseph Stalin, whose spies already knew that the United States had the atomic bomb. So essentially, Harry Truman is told that he has this weapon that could potentially end the war. And remember, Harry Truman is a straight shooter. He's a commonsensical kind of guy, sees the world in black and white. And he's told that he has a bomb that can wipe out a city and maybe get Japan to surrender. So Harry Truman says, okay, well, we'll use it then. The United States does send out warnings to Japan that they should surrender or face sheer and utter destruction. The Japanese do not, and on August 6th of 1945, the United States drops the first ever atomic weapon on a country during a time of war, and Hiroshima, Japan is absolutely obliterated. At least 70,000 people die, perhaps as high as 100,000 in this explosion. And in this atomic explosion, heat is so intense that shadows of people and other items are actually burned onto the ground due to the intense heat from this thing. The bomb actually exploded at about 1,700 feet in the air. That gives it its most effectiveness to cause a strong nuclear wind. And the image that you see here is actually downtown. That's all that's left of the downtown after one bomb. Well, the Japanese still do not surrender, amazingly. So Harry Truman orders the dropping of another one of these atomic bombs, and this one is on Nagasaki, Japan. And you can see Nagasaki here just totally devastated. Overall, these two atomic bombs probably killed upwards of 150 to maybe 200,000 people just with two bombs. And finally, the Japanese government totally falling apart at this juncture, finally capitulates and surrenders to the United States after the dropping of this second atomic bomb. But the use of these atomic bombs, of course, is extremely controversial, right? Should the United States have opened up this Pandora's box, if you will, of using atomic weapons in warfare? It took, 150 to 200,000 lives, but what may have been the cost of a U.S. invasion of Japan for both the Japanese and the U.S. So these are the things that were kind of weighed, in the minds of U.S. decision makers. But in the end, to this day, this is extremely controversial, the use of the atomic bombs during World War II. And here you see an image in the upper right there of the Japanese surrendering aboard the USS Missouri. If you go to Hawaii today to Pearl Harbor, you'll see a line of ships, and the first ship, of course, is under the water, the Arizona, the Memorial, and the last one is the Missouri, because this is where the Japanese surrendered. The official surrender is on 2 September of 1945, so the war is officially over once the Japanese finally call it quits. But after World War II, we have an entirely new world. There's no question after World War II that the United States is easily the preeminent global power. It's the number one economy. It's the number one military. It has a monopoly on nuclear weapons. When the United States dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, they did have one left after that. But of course, production of nuclear weapons will go into hyperdrive very shortly. But there's no one that can rival the United States following World War II. World War II pulls the U.S. out of the Great Depression just due to the spending, putting people back to work, and then people having jobs, and then demand after World War II to rebuild the planet, basically. Japan is destroyed. Europe is destroyed. Much of the Soviet Union is destroyed. Former colonial areas like Latin America and Africa, China, Southeast Asia, they're all a mess. China is in the midst of a terrible civil war after the Japanese invasion. So the world is obliterated, with really only the United States emerging from this war unscathed. And it is indeed the preeminent power. And basically, the United States has introduced this atomic age. Now, it becomes very clear after World War II that in order to compete internationally, in order to maintain your power, that you have to have nuclear weapons or nuclear power in order to maintain your independence, or at least, that's the feeling that countries are going to have in the midst of what comes to be called the Cold War. And moreover, recall that Europe, as well as Japan, but Europe especially had, colonial peoples. It controlled Africa, it controlled Southeast Asia. And now these people who have been oppressed for so long finally have their opportunity to break away. And this process is something that we call in Asia and Africa decolonization, where essentially these places, British, the French, the Germans, they can't afford to hold on to these places any longer. And we'll increasingly see all of these countries becoming independent all across Africa and also in Southeast Asia. In terms of the United States, so basically what World War II does is it creates this radical redistribution of world power. The United States being the hegemon, hegemonic meaning holding all the power. But there is a distant second in the Soviet Union. Yeah, the Soviets were obliterated by World War II from the Nazi invasion, and the USSR lost the most people killed in World War II, just like in World War I. But still, the Soviet Union, just because of its sheer size and its industrialization under Lenin and Stalin prior to the conflict, gave it the opportunity to rebound in a sense. And two, the Soviet Union is going to have its own nuclear weapon as we roll shortly after World War II. So essentially what happens is we have this kind of stalemate between two major nuclear powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, and what comes to be called a Cold War. Cold War is a conflict in which there's not actual direct fighting between the two major powers, but they use something called proxy wars. In other words, arming soldiers in other places to fight for the cause of that particular country. For example, in the Korean War that'll happen in 50 to 53, you're going to have the Northern Koreans being armed by the Soviet Union, by Communist China, right, to fight against the United Nations, and let's be realistic here, the United States in that conflict. So basically, we get these Vietnam War, Grenada, throughout all of the Cold War, all of these proxy wars that'll be fought between these sides, Afghanistan, back in the 1970s as well. And basically what we have then is this conflict between capitalism and communism. And that becomes this kind of big question of this new Cold War, this new atomic age, is, will places fall to communism or fall to capitalism? And that leads us into this Cold War, and the stakes, of course, are higher than ever with nuclear weapons. Soviet Union gets theirs shortly after the US, then China, France, Britain. These countries will get nuclear weapons. Today, there's about 8 or 9 nuclear powers on the planet, but the stakes are high in this Cold War that emerges after World War II. And that's all that we have for you to finish up World War II. Thanks for listening.